everyone. Thank you all for coming in the snow. It's really great to see everybody here. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the 20th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Established in 1998 as the Center for Comparative Literature and Society and attaining institute status in 2006, we've been a national model for rigorous cross-disciplinarity at the interface of the humanities and the social sciences and between the human sciences and the natural sciences. I'm Anupama Rao, the acting director of ICLS, and I'll return to make brief closing remarks. But now I'm channeling Vidya Lu, our director, who's stuck in the snowstorm and has been driving for the last 6.5 hours to get here from Princeton. So she'll show up momentarily. But in the meantime, I think we should get started. And we're really very, very proud to have Dean Sarah Cole of the Humanities with us on the opening night of our celebrations. Our Dean is a distinguished scholar of modern British literature, and she's part professor of English and Comp Lit at Columbia University. She's going to kick off our two-day event with opening remarks. Her office is a co-sponsor of our celebratory event, which will continue through tomorrow all day. Other co-sponsors are the Office of the President, the Office of the EVP and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Office of the Dean of Social Sciences, as well as the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought at the Columbia Law School. I want to acknowledge all of their support with tremendous gratitude, and I also want to thank Sarah Monks and her team for their hard work. None of this would have happened without Sarah and her team, so thank you very, very much indeed. I want to ask Sarah to come up and make some welcome remarks, and then I'll come back and introduce the speakers for the evening. But please welcome Sarah Cole, and thank you, Sarah, so much.
Thank you. So let me just say I'm going to read some remarks, but before I do that, I want to apologize in advance for running out. I didn't have to drive 6.5 hours to get, I guess, halfway from Princeton or wherever she is, but my son is stuck at school in the Bronx, so there's a lot of stuff going on. So I'm very, very sorry to be missing what I know is going to be an absolutely fabulous panel. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to help introduce the 20th anniversary celebration for the founding of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. I know it was not originally founded as an institute, but let's call it that for this. I can't decide if 20 years is a short time or a long time. In the case of the founding of ICLS, I think maybe it's both. On one hand, it's inspiring to think of all that this institute has done at and for Columbia over these 2 decades. It's astonishing that so much new thinking could be engendered and institutionalized so quickly. On the other hand, it is genuinely unimaginable to think of the humanities, in particular at Columbia, without ICLS. It has become part of our institutional identity and of our DNA. I think this sense of the Institute's simultaneous youth and age is testament to the kind of space it is, to the kind of work it fosters, to the tremendous faculty and students it gathers, and to its spirit. I want to say a few things about those qualities. But first, let me offer a very brief reflection both on the idea of the anniversary and on the principle of comparative thought, which is the core commitment of the Institute we celebrate tonight and the theme of this 2-day set of events. As you all know, there's another anniversary just wrapping up of the First World War, which concluded its bloody, useless slaughter 100 years and 4 days ago. Nobody can confidently state the cause of the First World War, but we do know that one of its primary driving factors was nationalism. The exponential rise of nationalism in Europe toward the end of the 19th century had, as we know, powerful consequences all around the world, manifested in the joyful willingness of hundreds of thousands of young men to rush off to the recruiting stations in August of 1914. 4 long and bloody years later, one is compelled to ask, what exactly had happened, and how can we extract anything positive from this disaster? One idea that gripped the imagination during the post-World War I period was that maybe this could be the war that would end war. In other words, that its catastrophe would finally prove to people that they had to give up their narrow national consciousness along with their imperial ambitions and their gigantic weapons programs and embrace an equitable global orientation where peace would be the product of an international or even non-national approach to the self and to the world. That did not happen. But for me, to go back to the moment of November 11th, 1918, is to ask what other kinds of worlds might we have chosen to create? Might we choose to create now? There are so many ways in which a multilingual and globally egalitarian concept could have been the outcome. As scholars, we cannot rewrite history, but we can return to our essential assumptions about how we think and how we approach the world around us as we write, speak, sing, perform, build, remember. Which brings us back to ICLS. What a joy to be celebrating this institute, reflecting on its past and looking ahead to its future. As Dean of Humanities, I take special pride in this institute, which is a kind of jewel. It embodies what is vital, vibrant, and forward-looking in the humanities today. It is a hub for scholars and students who are pressing inquiries that push beyond the national, linguistic, and intellectual borders of our traditional disciplines. One thing I find so wonderful about the work that goes on at ICLS is that it is so varied and so creative. There is no one kind of ICLS faculty member or student. They come from every department in the humanities and social sciences and from other schools on campus as well. I'm often surprised and always delighted by how many different people cross paths here, doing work of diverse kinds, teaching such interesting courses, thinking of new configurations of ideas, concepts, geographies, and modes of knowing. The faculty who built and continue to sustain ICLS are not, let's be clear, refugees from their departments. They don't end up here because they are unhappy elsewhere in their departments or somewhere else. On the contrary, many of these devoted members of this group are also among the absolute stars in their own departments. ICLS is additive in this sense. It's a place where the stellar work of the traditional disciplines gets reframed, or expanded, or transformed. It both invites and cultivates our intellectual leaders, and it fosters thinking that is generative, expansive, and ethically motivated. Of the many grants and projects that have incubated here, I would note just two recent and especially fruitful ones. First, the program in Literature, Medicine, and Society, which exemplifies what is so exciting in the still new field of medical humanities, and the Mellon Sawyer Seminar on Global Language Justice, a multi-year extravaganza of events, programs, learning, and intervention that has generated new pedagogy as well. And speaking of pedagogy, let me close by praising ICLS for being so deeply committed to its teaching and its students. It is telling that this anniversary event will feature as its culmination a discussion with former students. ICLS understands itself to be training people. It wants to bring its innovative and thoughtful approach to the world and its traditions, cultures, texts, and people to our fabulous Columbia students. And it learns from them as well, in the hopes that they will move on from here with these critical methodologies and with a desire to keep pressuring, keep asking, and keep thinking according to a frame of mind that is comparative and plural. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Anu back up to introduce the speaker.
Thank you very, very much for those really lovely words, kind and generous, but more important for Sarah's recognition and support of what ICLS stands for in this university and in the nation. And certainly for the Institute, questions of the politics and poetics of language, issues concerning translation, transition, transliteration, commensuration have all been deeply significant. So too questions about excess, the remainder, the destitute, the unhomed, all, I think, forms and modes of thought, but also questions that have been ongoing concerns for the Institute. One thing that makes this occasion very special and most memorable for us, for Lydia and I, is the gathering or reunification of all of our former directors, our alumni, and current ICLS faculty and students in one place. The alumni whose names you'll find in the program all accepted our invitation to speak at tomorrow's symposium. Isn't it amazing, Lydia asks, that nobody turned us down, perhaps out of loyalty to their alma mater, or out of a kind of homesickness, or for their love of the city of New York. In our invitation letter, we asked them to consider the possibilities and challenges they face when they pursue comparative, multilingual, transregional, or interdisciplinary work. For example, have the conditions of theoretical work changed significantly since you were a student at Columbia University 15 years ago, or even 7 or 8 years ago? And indeed, if we are thinking about the centenary of World War I, we must also think about our ongoing current war and the situations of deep devastation and catastrophe, indeed, that we have to think with and think against. And so what are some of the challenges we asked as we invited our alumni back? What are some of the challenges that you can identify? Can we imagine other ways of writing, living, communicating, and doing scholarship? So we'd like to welcome a warm welcome to our alumni and say to you that ICLS, or what used to be called CCLS, was your home and will always be your home. We look forward to your symposium tomorrow and also to the World Leaders Forum that will feature our keynote speaker, Ashish Nandi, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Now it gives me great honor and immense pleasure to invite our former directors, Professor Emeritus Andreas Poisson, University Professor Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, and Professor Stathis Gurguris to the front. Each of them have been asked to offer remarks no more than about 20 minutes. And that panel will be moderated by Professor Reinhold Martin, a longtime member of ICLS until recently. Reinhold is also currently the director of the Columbia Society of Fellows and professor of architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. As I invite our three ex-directors up, let me just very briefly introduce them with an institutional introduction. We would be here all evening if I was to do an actual introduction to each of them. And so this is the order in which they'll be offering their remarks. Andreas Poisson is the retired Willard Professor of German and Comparative Literature. He was ICLS Director from fall 1998 to spring 2006 and actually oversaw the center becoming an institute. As did Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, who was University Professor of the Humanities. She was ICLS Director between fall 2006 and spring 2009. And Stathis Gurguris, who's Professor of Classics and of English and Comparative Literature, who was Director from fall 2009 to spring 2015. So please join us in welcoming them, and we look forward to your comments.
Okay, as Anu said, we're going to proceed, in a sense, down the line in order of directorship. More or less 20 minutes. Yeah.
3 ducks in a row. Easy targets.
After which I was asked to prepare one question. I have one question. I'll withhold that until the end. And so we'll just begin with Andreas and proceed from there.
Okay, thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me? What are they doing?
Traveling too much with this one.
Okay, this works better now. How am I going to read this? Anyway, 20 years of CCLS, ICLS. A long time or a short period? I think it must be a long time because it's hard to remember the beginnings. And I had to labor in order to do it. This event is a milestone, so I want to begin by thanking both Lydia and Anu and the staff, Sarah, Kelly, and others for having organized this celebratory occasion. Let's give them another round of applause. In a certain way, Sarah Cole already suggested that this may be the season of anniversary celebrations. Our own 20th preceded by the recent 50th anniversary of the 1968 founding of the Center for 20th Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I taught from 1971 to 1986. It was one of the very first humanities centers in the country challenging the isolation of disciplines in the university structure. That anniversary was also celebrated with a symposium and get-together with former players, participants, alumni in late October. Now, the coincidence of these two events gave me ample opportunity to reflect about that past and the years after at Columbia, which resulted in the founding of ICLS at the tail end of the 20th century. Now, there are two reasons why I'm mentioning the Center for 20th Century Studies here. That's why I first heard Gayatri in 1977 deliver a lecture, Object Woman in Dante and Yeats.
Oh my! Yes.
Well, the archive helped. And again the year after when she spoke about the discourse of woman. And when I think we first met face to face, but I'm not quite sure about that anymore. She was already formidable at that time. She was tenured when I had barely started my first job. And by 1977, she chaired the Complete department at the University of Iowa, which she had reconstructed.
He's young, younger than I, see?
She's my senior. She's my senior in every way. The second reason is that it was at that center that I first learned to work in an interdisciplinary fashion and to engage the contemporary world in my publications after having been trained in Europe in traditional forms of a rather unhistorical and unpolitical literary criticism that was first being challenged in the late 1960s. My dissertation was on romantic theories of translation, and all of my early published work was on 18th or 19th century German literature. After all, the 20th century barely even existed in the curricula of German universities at that time. Like many in the early 70s, I had to retrain, re-educate myself in the highly politicized context of the Vietnam War and the civil rights struggles. I should add that my degree was in German and Romance literatures, not complete, which the Nazis had erased as a discipline from the German Academy by driving all the major comparatists, many of them Jewish, into exile. For us in Wisconsin's German departments, it was the reappropriation of Weimar and post-Weimar traditions of Western Marxism, especially Frankfurt School critical theory, that kept us very busy. Critical theory had begun to have resonances within the American New Left, and thus we founded a new journal, New German Critique, deluding ourselves that the American left needed nothing so much as a strong dose of German literary theory in order to prosper. You'll have to remember, the Frankfurt School is now a household name, even in a perverse way, with Breitbart and Bannon. At that time, in the US, it was not. Martin Jay's trailblazing account of the dialectical imagination was only published in 1972. Now, the center in Milwaukee gave me the opportunity to invite lecturers and organize conferences that featured this tradition, which became part of the center's programs, together with post-structuralism. Lyotard was a regular. Film theory, the screen group from the UK came year after year, and the visual arts in the intersection between modernism and postmodernism. Clearly, the main focus was on European theory and transatlantic relations, with a strong component of feminist theory and gender issues. When I came to Columbia in 1986 with the express task to rebuild the moribund German department, there was no such lively humanities center. The Heyman Center was a very different bird at the time. There was, however, the Interdepartmental Committee on Comparative Literature, chaired until the late 90s by Edward Said, who had also chaired the search committee that hired me. This Interdepartmental Committee, on which I served for many years, was a limited operation. There was no dedicated curriculum for comparatists, only a smorgasbord of courses offered through the various language departments, and there was only a sickly and undernourished undergraduate program in Complete run by the English department. The need for something bigger and more rigorous was obvious. But what would it be? Several proposals were tossed around, but in the end, Vice President David Cohen settled on me as the person to direct a newly founded center, probably because I had proven myself with rebuilding the German department, and despite the fact that I didn't have proper, complete credentials. This is when my close cooperation with Gayatri began. I've always considered the two of us together being the founding directors of CCLS, together with several other dedicated colleagues, Mark van Hagen, Ros Morris, and others with whom we could not have done it. It was always a collective enterprise, to use an old-fashioned term. Despite our very different backgrounds and trajectories, we had a number of things in common, Gayatri and me. The commitment first to rigorous language training, which stood against the practice of teaching everything in English in some complete programs, the commitment to new forms of close reading in an expanded field, the need to open up the humanities disciplines to the social sciences, which actually resulted, of course, in the naming of the project, Center for Complete and Society, and the uncompromising commitment to critical theoretical reflection. None of this current post-critique nonsense. The early lengthy meetings of our executive committee, called KLEX, and KLEX is a German word that means the stain. Now you may want to rename the committee after this, I don't know. Anyway, these lengthy meetings were more like intellectual debates about the kind of change we all felt was necessary for the field of comparative literature. Linguistic expansion beyond the canonical trinity of German, French, and English was a sine qua non, and so was geographic expansion beyond Europe in the context of post-colonial theory, and disciplinary expansion toward the social sciences, toward architecture, and toward the arts. The conundrum was, and still is, how to construct a curriculum out of such vast ambitions. At a practical pedagogic level, and this is the one aspect I want to focus on here, we were convinced about the benefits of team teaching to develop new intellectual cross-disciplinary projects. I myself could draw, at the time, on my Milwaukee experiences of team teaching with, among others, Teresa de Lauretis on semiotics and Marxism. Gayatri taught with Jack Snyder and Jeremy Waldron. I team taught the various intros to complete in society with Val Daniel and Ross Morris, in addition to seminars with historians on memory politics and on world fairs. I actually saw a recent account of the number of team-taught courses, and I was amazed. The year 2001, 2002 was a high point. We had 10 team-taught courses during that year. In other years, it was at least always 4 to 5, but that was the highest year, probably because we had more money at the time. In the first few years of CCLS, we offered an average of 6 team-taught courses per year, a number not always matched in later years. But team teaching was and remains crucial, not just for the benefit of students, but for faculty training in cross-disciplinary work. The goal was, and still is, I take it, to couple faculty from the humanities with faculty from the social sciences or other schools, such as architecture, law, or the arts. I must say I've always learned more from teaching with a colleague from another discipline than from teaching with myself. It was hours and hours of extra work to develop a syllabus for those courses, but the awards were always obvious.
Yes.
And yet, team teaching posed difficulties. It would be an understatement to say that convincing faculty in the hard social sciences to join was not an easy task in those first years. It was also not always easy to corral colleagues from smaller departments into this venture, even though we had some buyout money at the time. Team teaching collided with the staffing needs of small programs, but we did have the support from the VPs and the Provost's office. Which brings me to the need for fundraising and to the vicissitudes of having to write application prose. Columbia helped with a generous startup grant. David Cohen, the vice president, provided links to various foundations. Key was a Ford Foundation and its initiative Crossing Borders, which provided significant support with a 2-year grant. The program has 3-year grants, so there may be a gap in my memory. I had it down for 2 years. But anyway, Crossing Borders was the title of a pamphlet written by Toby Folkman, at the time program officer at the Ford Foundation. It was a response to the crisis of area studies after the end of the Cold War in 1989-90. Its topics were reconceptualizing the notion of area, Borders and Diasporas, Curricular Transformations, Rethinking Scientific Areas, and so forth. Ford did support us, though its reconceptualizing of area studies did not include comparative literature per se. Crossing Borders, however, is also the title of the first chapter in Gayatri's WELEC lectures, entitled Death of a Discipline, 2003. Lectures in which Gayatri laid out the need for a radically new comparative literature in the context of the field's history. I've always read this book as a brilliant articulation of the themes and topics that occupied us in those early meetings of CLEX, where we tried to come up with a theoretical and practical redefinition of a notoriously difficult discipline to define. So let me quote from the acknowledgements of the WELEC lectures and their urgent call for a new comparative literature. Here's what Gayatri said or wrote. I hope the book will be read as the last gasp of a dying discipline. A gasp is better than silence. One can write in the hope that there may be some in the Academy who do not believe that the critical edge of the humanities should be appropriated and determined by the market. Perhaps not immediately, but one of these days, let the ghost dance. End quote. Well, the ghost may have become embodied in new ways at our institute, but the situation of the humanities today may be worse now than it was 15 years ago. No reason to give up, but to continue the struggle to learn and to teach, to read and to act in new ways. Now, I have always said that I consider having been part of the creation of this institute a major professional achievement which I was privileged to head at its beginnings. The intellectual camaraderie, the sense of creating something new at Columbia was always inspiring. Of course, it did all have an impact on my own scholarly work. And since we were explicitly asked to comment on that as well, let me just say a few things. And for those who want to know more about it, I should say I have recently described my intellectual trajectory in much more detail in an essay entitled Mustang Red, My American Road to Critical Theory, which was published in a volume on transatlantic German studies, probably kind of a swan song of a generation. But the first and most obvious way, closely tied to the institutionalization of CCLS, was a Mellon grant for a Sawyer seminar I put together for the 2001-02 academic year in close cooperation of CCLS with the School of Architecture. And as has been mentioned, Lydia Liu just received in another context another Sawyer grant for the current period. Now, Bernhard Schumi, as Dean of the Architecture School, and Reinhold, as close intellectual friend, were enormously helpful at the time, as was Neil Brenner, an urbanist at NYU, whom I consulted extensively. The project was called Globalizing City Cultures, and it resulted in an edited volume, Other Cities, Other Worlds, Urban Imaginaries in a Globalizing Age, published in 2008. The book took a stance against the global cities discourse of the 1990s by focusing exclusively on cities from beyond the northern transatlantic. No New York, no London, no Paris. Instead, cities from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, which exemplified in multiple ways the broken promises of modernity. The book emphasized the cultural dimensions of life in cities, urban imaginaries, which were given short shrift in urban studies at the time. Bi-weekly lectures by major scholars from those cities, Beatrice Saulo, Nestor Garcia Canclini, Akbar Abbas, architects like Ram Koolhaas, Raoul Mirotra, and writers like Orhan Pamuk, were coupled with intense readings and discussions of their work. It was an incredible learning experience for me and for the students, several of whom went on to careers in urban and in architectural studies. The work in ICLS also broadened my horizon beyond the transatlantic focus on modernism and postmodernism, which was so central in my earlier publications. In retrospective, it became clear to me how the postmodernism debate of the 70s and 80s had been rather parochial in the United States. Of course, I am not a post-colonial critic, but the need to understand the appropriations of European, American, postmodernism and modernism in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa and Asia, not simply as derivative, but as a creative appropriation in reverse, had become inevitable. Not just modernity at large, in Arjuna Padurai's sense, but modernism at large, which was one of my key topics in research. But how could I then tackle this subject when I always felt that the need for deep historical and linguistic knowledge was indispensable for serious work? Knowledge I did not have as a Europeanist, trained only in a few Western European languages. But ICLS encouraged me to engage in what I've often called, since then, and against the common depreciation and mindful of Goethe and Schiller's definition, controlled dilettantism. Theories of modernism and modernity, then, one of my major topics in teaching within ICLS. This is where my interest in the contemporary visual arts linked up with my long-standing commitment as a German citizen to memory politics, and ever more so today, I might add, for all the obvious political reasons. In the 1990s, I had become increasingly aware of the ways in which Holocaust tropes and images had traveled into politically very different contexts, especially in Latin America after the military dictatorships, in South Africa after the end of apartheid, and to some extent in India, where the violent partition of 1947 kept replaying itself in pogroms in 1992 and again later in 2002. Increasingly, artists working in those countries turned to a kind of memory art that worked out of the archive of modernist, postmodernist forms, translating and adapting them to different cultural and political histories and situations. Without the challenges of ICLS, I would probably have been even more hesitant to write about artists like Nalini Malani and Vivan Sundaram from India, William Kentridge from South Africa, or Guillermo Cuitca and Doris Salcedo from Argentina and Colombia, respectively. But this is my current project, which may or may not result in a book publication. Tentative title, Memories of Europe in the Art from Elsewhere. If it happens, if the book happens, I will dedicate the book to ICLS, promise. So thanks again to all of you who have made ICLS into such a success story. Without your enthusiasm and commitment, it could not have happened. Happy birthday to all of us.
So shall I just... Okay. Yeah. Andreas, thank you so much. Is the mic picking me up? You can all hear me in the back? Thank you so much for remembering, the way we work together. I must say that I was asked to say something funny when Andreas was retiring, and I said something which is not funny to him, but very funny to me. We would go together to these complete things, fundraising meetings and so on. And in my speeches, I would always say, as my director says, and Andreas would really scold me after the whole. Why do you call me your director in that way? But
ever since then, I have come to call you my senior.
There we go. See, he's taking it from me now. But you see, Andreas said he did not have proper complete credentials. See, my role in complete really is that of a clown. I know nothing. I went into complete because I had come to the United States because I had very strongly criticized my university. I was supporting myself. I was 18 years old. My father was dead. And so I was told I would not get a first class in my MA. And at that time, 5-year plans, a humanities student could not even get a passport unless she had money to go on her own. Could not even get a passport without a first class. I had managed a first class in my BA, so I borrowed money on what was then called a life mortgage, and I came. Now, because that was before Lyndon Johnson changed the alien registration in 1965, since my I was not a native speaker of English. I spoke English as I do now, except I had a much stronger British accent.
Getting signals from the
Okay,
audience.
much stronger British. Can I not take this out? It's much easier. Yes. Much stronger British accent because I had I had imitated the BBC Third program before it was diversified, so that I would get higher paying students as I was supporting myself in Calcutta. But because English was not my native language, I was not given a teaching assistantship in the English department. So here I was, 20 years old, no money, no visa, no work permit, about to be deported. So Deman, who was just then the new director of comparative literature, had some financial aid slots, all of which she had filled, except one. And if you don't fill a financial aid slot, it's soft money, you lose it. And so he offered it to me, and I thought it was because I was brilliant. But later, when I myself became chair of Conflict, I told Paul, I said, Paul, that's what it was, wasn't it? You had to fill your whatchamacallit, and if I wasn't good, then you could have said cultural difference. Isn't that what it was? And so he gave me a little twinkle of a smile, and he said, well, Gayatri, you were always too smart. So that's the story. So therefore, I'd only had 3 months of German from a woman who was the German, extremely casteist, Andreas, what can I tell you? The German widow of a Bengali freedom fighter in Calcutta, 3 months of German. Zeit ist Geld. And she did do something. She made me read everything in that other, what's it called? The alphabet, the print, not the Latin one. What's it called now? The German. What's it called? The German script that's not Latin.
Oh, Zitterling.
Yes,
Yeah,
that
Zitterling.
she made me read all that, so I have very cheap, complete works, because, those don't sell anymore.
That's
So
useless knowledge.
you're useful because it saved money, But, so that's all the German I'd had. And all the French, because I went to a poor university, they had no foreign language departments or anything. And all the French I'd had was one course in the Centre Culturel of Galliot-Française in Calcutta in 1960. But because Deman had to fill his whatchamacallit with just that much, I dragged myself into complete. So I, in fact, know nothing. I'm a clown in comparative literature. But, I've been moving right along. And I will speak a bit as a clown too. Now, comparative literature at Columbia is the oldest in the United States. If you look at the definitive history of Columbia, you will read that it was established because 2 professors in the English department wanted to teach the same thing in 2 different ways. I believe it was what was then called the European Renaissance. One professor got his PhD from Heidelberg, and the other from the University of Virginia. Real difference there. There was conflict. President Seth Low, in his infinite wisdom, instantly created a program in comparative literature, and the 2 professors could teach the same thing differently. That's the beginning. And you find this in the definitive history, because, the days of really pretending to vision and so on, they hadn't begun yet when the history was written. The beginning of, and I say this really also because people have to realize, and I see some of my students here, by the way, I taught a great deal with old Hamid. I mean, both Fuad and Ben were in that Hamid thing, and the rewards and awards and etc. one could discuss. But at any rate, the Hamid Dabashi, of course, I mean. The begin, and I say this really to the students because once anything, the university as an institution has its history that goes back to medieval Europe, not much changed. And once something is institutionalized is not so good, but once something is, what we actually fight and we fought was the incredibly heavy tradition of the institutional directives rather than the directives of our vision. And so, although this may seem like I'm just, this is not how one should speak when one is, being heavy duty, one of the reasons is that we have to realize that the institutional politics should not be deep background. They should, in fact, be right there on the table. The only way to talk about that is funnily today. So, the beginning of the Center for Comparative Literature was right in the Columbia tradition. There was an interest in establishing a European Enlightenment-style institute. Spivak, perceived as always, wrongly, as the greatest enemy of the European Enlightenment, was blissfully kept ignorant of this. But CCLS, as it was then, owes it all to woman power. Owes it all to woman power. Professor Jean Howard, then director of the Institute of Research on Women and Gender, snuck me into the external committee. Oh my. And in 3 days, Professor Joan Ferranti, a massive feminist presence, whose legacy is still felt in the stunning work of her student Teodolinda Barolini, virtually dragged me screaming to the internal committee. Anu, you have asked us, as Andreas remarked, to connect our relationship to the early days of CCLS to our scholarship. In my case, it was just the opposite. Since I was quite unprepared for these meetings, I fell back on what I had been writing and thinking since the 70s, and you mentioned the chairship of the Iowa department. And as I say, I know nothing, but at least I accept that I don't pretend that I'm a really well-qualified comparative literature person. All my students know this. So that from that point of view, I try to work as well as I can so that there can be a regular, complete thing. And Iowa at that point actually won the acclaim of the New Republic, which is hardly my friend, as one of the best comparative literature programs, departments in the country, with Yale, Hopkins, and Berkeley. So it was, something was going on. So in fact, when I got in this way, dragged in by women into these committees, in fact, I hadn't prepared anything except the thinking since the 70s. I became director in 1975. And so, in fact, the scholarship was the scholarship about institution building rather than comparative literature as such. So that's what actually came forward. I fell back on what I had been writing and thinking since the 70s. And then I forgot all about this because I never win at these things. So, winning, in fact, is not an issue, and it was fun. I was dragged in, I talked, goodbye. And then after that, people were machinating one way or the other. I had no idea. We had at that time a thoughtful, benign, and efficient vice president, David Cohen, whom Andreas mentioned, not quite Seth Low, but a good man. Now, I'm going to say something, but as Andreas said, he already knew how wonderfully Andreas had built German. But there is a little story that I never tire of saying, and I'm being a clown. So he asked me if there should be a center. I was completely surprised. He had called me for a meeting. I, completely surprised, said yes. He asked if I wanted to direct. I said no. It would fold if I directed. And and I said, Andreas knows this, we need a laid-back, smart white guy. And I'll bring you one. I see. But as he says, Cohen already knew his achievements, but I said this to him. I knocked on Andreas Hussen's door, and the rest is history. You will admit, he's a very smart, laid-back white guy. So, what now? How much time do I have? 2 minutes?
You've got time.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. So, what were our ideas? And these were very anti-institutional ideas. And apart from the people that Andreas has mentioned, I'll also mention Victoria de Grazia. And also, in fact, Reinhold, I had dragged Reinhold in. I was dragging people in and I had dragged him in, remember? So therefore, I mean, because he's a professional school, what is he doing with us, right? So, but, I knew a good thing. You see, I know good things, that's the whole thing. And so, our idea was that there should be no, core group of teachers, that it would be the whole school, and at some point, this is where the team teaching came in. It was like pulling teeth having Jack Snyder come. I mean, he's a good guy, but on the other hand, who wants to come teach with literary types, And so therefore, this team teaching stuff was a very hard one because we had decided that every faculty member at the university was, in fact, also a member of CCLS. Remember, this is what it was. It's a very, very counter-intuitive kind of institutional approach, and we really pushed. I mean, we worked like dogs. We were like early Christians. We were not being fed to that. We were not being fed to the lions, but perhaps we were, who knows. Anyway, and of course there was also the humanities and the social sciences. Now, the humanities and the social sciences, there's a great deal to say about that, the way in which we constantly actually, Reinhold, in fact, called those when he thanked me in one of his books, and I said, Reinhold, why did you thank me? I mean, I've never had you as a student, I've been your year, but I mean, I've known you as a graduate student, but that's about it. So he said, because those CLEX meetings were like seminars. That's why I've thanked you. So it comes from outside. And so there's a great deal to say about how we try to think about the humanities and social sciences. We can't talk about that now. So I will just quote myself. I was just at Coimbra, and they had asked me, university, they had asked me to inaugurate it was like a reverse commencement, all of the PhD students in their new Institute of Sociology at the university. And they had precisely asked me because I was in the humanities. So I gave them as a title, Study, Know, Learn, Hear, Listen, Do, the humanities on the social sciences. And I spoke about all these versions of cognitive activity, right? And one of the biggest changes was the change from study and learn, which is absolutely important, idea of knowledge is knowledge about knowledge, but absolutely important to do responsibly. We can't turn our back on that one. But then the move into learning when the subject position changes. Because in the study and learn, you are a very responsible investigator, investigating as responsibly as possible your object of investigation. But when it changes into the cognitive version, which I call learn, I mean, one has to be simple in one's language when one is so ignorant. The idea of learning, the subject position changes and passes to whatever it is that you are learning, not so much about, but from. This is an extremely, extremely dangerous, it brings in the incalculable. This is an effort that really depends on very deep language learning, apart from everything else, deep language learning. So this idea of how to do social sciences, I just wanted to give my title, then do, I'm very deeply in tune with Gramsci, not really following him so much as discovering that there was something there which I must have internalized and learned in some way. So therefore, the idea of moving into this learning syndrome, the deep language learning, so that the agency passes to the one who holds the language. This is something that also relates to Gramsci's idea of the new intellectual as the permanent persuader, so that the notion of how to learn to do that. Such big things are said these days. You see, such big things, such success is claimed. The idea, of a laid-back white guy, if it had been today, I would have had to say a tremendously well-dressed, corporate-looking, tall white guy. And the thing is, first of all, I knew none of them. Second of all, even if I did, they did not trust me. And third of all, our center would not have started with such a man. But that's what it is now. So to an extent, the claims of success is not, those claims are not what makes a really good, permanently persuading comparative literature, which knows to learn from its mistakes. That's what Andreas was talking about. I mean, the theme of his talk was that one. And so that's why we worked so well together, to be able to, and this does not make you weak. So to an extent, language, I come to that. Because, Ashish is not here, of course, in such weather, and also he will be there tomorrow doing his world thing. But Ashish Nandi, the guy who's going to be the keynotist, I was just in Tricur in Kerala talking, and the last time I was at a conference with him, I've known him forever, so the last time I was at a conference with him was in Tricur, and I gave a talk, and Ashish, who's not particularly a fan of my stuff, nor am I, and so Ashish, however, said to me, Gayatri, this is the best talk that I have ever heard you give. And that was the talk where I was talking about the fact that comparative literature must think that all languages, any language, even a language where only 2 people speak it now, can be a mother tongue. Mother tongue is a bad phrase. It's because of the African work that I do, and they all say unsystematized mother tongues, that I've fallen into saying that first language is better. And sometimes, there is not one first language, but many. Let's not go there. But at any rate, what I had said was that the language learnt before reasonableness, that's the one in which the ethical semiosis is laid out. I talked about Melanie Klein and so on. Ethical sign systems are laid down when, before reason, you learn, you actually invent a language, which is then inserted by the ones who know this language that the infant has invented. It's inserted willy-nilly into a language which has a history before the infant was born and will continue to have so after today's infant is dead. And so therefore, that human being is a blip in the history of that language. So to an extent, what comparative literature has to do is to work in the belief that why have I used up my time? Am I boring you? Okay. Because you see, I'm so intellectually insecure. Someone looks at it like that. Bloody hell, I should shut up. But I will just finish this thing. So this argument. So therefore, the idea that you have to imagine that it is possible for us, although actually impossible, to get into that level of the language. That is to say, the lingual memory, not something held in actual heads, but memory as we should know now because of the computers, the lingual memory held in the language. You cannot learn cultures, that's a joke. What you can learn is this kind of tremendously hard effort at a language, and the lingual memory begins to make what is called culture. It's a very bad word. I have a moratorium on that one. It stands in for all kinds of things, and ignoring class and so on and so forth. But let it be. But so therefore, this idea that you have to get into, my mother actually made me aware of this story. I have told my mother as I was standing in Paris airport with her, and somebody said, cup of coffee in the kind of upstate New York accent, and I said to my ma in Bengali, "Oh ma, I can't even hold that in my ear." And my ma, who had been a member of the All India Women's Congress way. She was born in 1913 and had really been the generation that had fought imperialism on the side of the Constitutional Convention, all kinds of things. She spoke up for English, and she said to me, "Dear, it is a mother tongue." And so that, Baba Matribhasha to. Now that thing, when my mother said that, saying yes to the enemy, and saying it is a mother tongue, when I said the accent was intolerable to my ear, I realized something, this thing that I'm talking about, that we have to, comparative literature, and how this relates to giving agency to the subaltern, I cannot speak about that now. But I will be speaking about it in Tunisia on the 22nd, and I have spoken about it at great length elsewhere. It's also published work, that the agency passes to an extent if you really believe that languages that have no particular political or historical power can also be the vehicle of ethical semiosis. You're a comparativist, and you're also showing how this vision of comparativism can in fact become something that will never save the world, because these kinds of things with each generation has to be repeated. This is not something that actually is established by changing state formations and so on, but at least it can remain looking towards the future. It can remain real work. And I think I'm going to end now. Anu has said nothing, but I should end by quoting something that I quote all the time. I quoted also that revolution thing, Marx's only description of the content, because of course, generally speaking, it's the value form. We know how revolutions are spoken of in that direction, and I'm not going to go there. But Marx's only description of the content of revolutions in the current time. The content, he writes, of the revolution of the 19th century will be the poetry of the future. The poetry of the future. That's what I'm talking about. Poetry, imagination, dance here rather than jump here. Remember? That's what it says. Dance here, not exalta. So those kinds of changes. And I'm writing about that for a big Bengali lecture, which I'm giving on the 19th, relationship between reason and imagination, against a card-carrying Marxist of the old school, right? His centenary thing, and I'm saying they did not, Second International Communism failed in West Bengal, my state, because they did not, in fact, attend to the imagination. So mechanical Marxism. So therefore, this is something that's very much in my mind, the poetry of the future. And Marx used, as I said here, the Greek word, poesie. Marx knew his Aristotle backwards. Not the fashionable German word at that time, dictum, no. So this whole thing, the thing about the poetry of the future, it's a method. It's not just a rhetorical way of speaking. Poetry as method. That's where all of that stuff about deep language learning as ethical semiosis, passing the agency to the subaltern, that's the task of the ghost dancing in comparative literature. So thank you for quoting that one, I'd forgotten it. Anyway, so my director, I think I will close here.
Okay. First of all, obviously my position is very different. It's different in two ways. The first one is very obvious, I think. Gayatri and Andreas were my teachers, at least by writing, before I met them. And when I came to ICLS, I actually came into something that they had already created, very much as they've chronicled, against the grain of academic culture. Here the word would be apt because it's bad. In fact, really an incredibly radical act of institution. So I came into this, and for me it was an extraordinary experience. It was almost magical, because I came into something that had made concrete practically everything that I was interested in and I aspired to, not just my work really, but really since I was let's say 16 years old, which in retrospect, obviously I didn't know at the time, I would say it is the entwinement, which is always contentious, between the poetic and the political, which is really what all my work has been about. But it's really not about work. It's really what makes my life valuable in the sense since I was a kid. So you can understand how astonishing it was for me to actually find this as a space, a pedagogical space, not just an academic space, and I'll talk a lot more about the difference in a minute. The other thing that's different, and this is kind of funny, my entire education, all my degrees, are in comparative literature. I am the only bona fide comparative literature person on this panel. There is a kind of interesting note to this, of course. When I was an undergraduate at UCLA, there was no comparative literature BA degree. There weren't any at the time. The only comparative literature departments, the few that existed, well, there weren't that many, had only PhD programs, and some of them were programs in departments and so on. It was very hard to find a BA in comparative literature. So I refused to compromise my interests by joining the English department, which would have been the first thing, or even the French department, that was the second thing, or maybe philosophy, but they weren't doing the philosophy I was interested in. Political science, I was interested in that, and where I had to deal with all this other, business that I really did not interest me. So I created a major. I created what, in retrospect, was a personal ICLS curriculum. And I am not kidding. I am not exaggerating at all. In retrospect, everything that I came into that was already established was exactly, almost to the T, the kinds of strains that I tried to put together as a 20-year-old in order to get a degree in something that I was interested in. Of course, it was literature. Of course, it was literature in many languages, a multilingual study of literature. But it was also a study of history, of political theory, and of the performing arts. So this was my major, which I constructed with a kind of, I obviously invented a reason, which was acceptable to the honors program, and I was able then to get my degree in what I wanted. And then I went on, obviously, to get a PhD in comparative literature. But ICLS as a kind of existing unit, that was what was remarkable about it. It wasn't just a theoretical construct. We're great theorists here. We are fabulous theorists, and this has been a space for theoretical thinking. But the great achievement of ICLS, which Andres and Gayatri founded, along with other colleagues, was that this was made concrete as a field of practice, as a place where, in fact, practice was what mobilized and animated the experience, not just simply the academic experience, but in fact the experience of really learning about the world, if I can say something so grand. So that is really the key. It's amazing. I was thinking, it's been 10 years since I first became director. Kind of amazing to me. I can't believe that it's been that long, and it seems that it was just yesterday. And yet, I came into what was something that was in the middle, but it wasn't in the middle because it had already catapulted itself since the day that it began. And the speed with which this space continues to evolve, continues to question itself, and continues to evolve, is really something that we all should treasure. It probably speaks my age, I guess, as well, that I'm now looking back. But I certainly treasure it looking back, and I'm only conveying to you the kind of magical kid-like experience that I had upon arriving to this thing, which was, and it still remains, unique in the entire country, in the world. There is because it's not a comparative literature department. It is a comparative literature department. We run more than that. It's way more than that. It's even beyond being a department, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to talk a little bit about those aspects that make this project. I think it's a project, still is a project, and I'd like to think of it that way. But a concrete project with real, training and a real effect in generations of students who are now in different fields. But it's still a project. So I want to talk a little bit about what are the aspects of this project that I consider essential and strange, but are, as I say, I repeat again, all of these things are the things that I truly adore since I can remember. So it is a pedagogical space primarily. It is a space of education primarily, a space of learning, of everyone learning. All at once and in very odd ways, in ways that are not comfortable, okay? That was certainly our intention, remains our intention, and I think that I think all of you who have been in this have experienced it from different positions. It was reconfiguring the parameters of learning against a certain kind of academic culture that was reducible to certain kinds of specializations and departmental limits, and within those departments there would be other sub-limits and sub-fields, but in essence following the same kind of logic. We tried to break this down in many ways. I mean, they did. That's how they got it started, okay, against the grain. Gayatri spoke at length, and she underlined the fact that this, as an institutional act, was against institutional established procedures. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do. So one of the first things that's remarkable about what we do is that we have no canon. We cannot have a canon because it's very difficult to say what are the limits of the parameters of our pedagogical enterprise. And I'm not just talking about simple interdisciplinarity, I'll get to this business. I'm talking about the fact that there's nothing to authorize what we do in advance of what we do. This sounds nice and fancy, but it's just a fact. It isn't that we don't have knowledge that we bring to the table or that we have not learned certain things that we are, even if we question them, are forming us still. It's just that whatever that is cannot be given a transcendental authority, an authority before us, before what we do, in advance of, elsewhere. So that's one thing. That makes teaching the introductory course very difficult, which we've done, many of us, and that's why it's better to be team taught. I'll get to this as well. There is no canon. We cannot just say, well, we're going to teach the methodology of comparative literature in society. Well, what is that? It's a practice, right? It's not a bunch of principles. The second thing, clearly, is the extraordinary range of methods. There again, there is no orthodoxy, there's no methodological orthodoxy. We are interested not just, of course, in an array of methods, like sort of supermarket of methods. We're interested in the contentious relation of methods. How methods, in fact, are always in some sort of contest, and how they inform each other, yes, but that in fact they are in contest. And learning in this mode is a very different kind of learning. Teaching this mode, which is the same thing as learning, is a different kind of learning. The third thing, which was something that was explicit, in Gayatri's own work beforehand, but certainly it was explicit in the inaugural position of the center at the time, was a certain kind of simultaneous historical and geographical thinking. These terms can be other terms, mind you, but I'm using a kind of language that can extend obviously from within the European tradition, from a certain kind of German way of thinking to obviously a certain Gramscian way of thinking, but it's obviously not European, it goes without saying. So a simultaneous historical and geographical thinking means a kind of interesting relation of time and space that, again, cannot be authorized by presupposed and closed concepts of what history is or what geography is, or the spaces are themselves contested. There are political spaces. This enters into the whole methodological contestation that I was speaking, but it has one currency, that runs through it. That's the key. Gayatri and Andreas both spoke about this, and that is language. Language, in the way that Gayatri, in fact, presented it perfectly well, is really the currency that enables us to think simultaneously in historical and geographical terms. That is to say, both across time and space in different and very problematic directions. This, you can see how this then, if we abstract it a bit, is about intersections, is about discovering intersections, and in fact creating intersections. Sometimes the two are the same. Again, I don't mean the simple interdisciplinarity. In fact, we have had this conversation for years. We are in favor of a disciplinarity, of a very complex disciplinarity. I would stake everything I have on the fact that ICLS is a specific kind of disciplinarity. It's a certain kind of way of practicing, practicing of knowledge, or whatever would be the term, within certain parameters that we are, of course, always questioning and rethinking and changing. But it isn't just simply bringing together a whole bunch of different things from different departments. It's not, let's say, bringing the social sciences to sit next to literary studies. Is actually, if we juxtapose the social sciences and literary studies, already these are huge and very abstract categories. If we were to just juxtapose them, they create trouble for each other. That's the trouble is that we're interested in. And forging a certain kind of pedagogy out of this sort of troubled terrain. This is reflected in our differences. ICLS has always been a collective project, and it continues to be a collective project. It cannot be done otherwise. But the collective project, again, does not follow some kind of pre-authorized position where, let's say, we all come to it and we agree and we proceed. On the contrary, it is itself very contentious, and the struggle over our own disciplinary differences, which we inevitably inherit no matter what we say, and our struggle over our differences that have to do with all those other things has been built into what we do. And I think that you as students have seen this in action. You've seen it in contention in the classroom when we are, of course, team teaching. You've seen it in the diversity of interests and things that are presented. So the literary, this I said all that, and then as I was thinking and writing these notes, the literary, what do we do with the literary? What happens to that? My response here is that the literary remains at the core. Now, I'm not a historian, I'm a literature person, so maybe I have some stakes in saying that, but I really think it is the case, and not because, again, of disciplinary knowledge. It is a kind of more of a modality of thinking, if I can say it that way, a way of reading, maybe we can use that term. It will be, I think, apt, and reading, obviously, through multiple languages, and languages both literally, in the deep learning sense that Gayatri spoke about, and, of course, figuratively, which then could metaphorize itself into disciplines. So a multilinguality, where the literary it becomes a kind of core mode of thinking and reading, remains, I think, throughout. So, I come back to the pedagogy with a couple of interesting sort of discussions. Obviously, we said points to discuss. Team teaching is the key. It's something that again, institutionally is against the grain. It's not simply pulling teeth with colleagues. It's really doing something that the administration profoundly dislikes. They consider that we work, we do half the labor for what we're paid, which is absurd because we actually do way much more. It's not even calculable, really. And we're not interested in that. So it's very difficult to make happen. But when it does, it's really the treasuring element of ICLS pedagogy. The reason for this, apart from anything else for me anyway, is the fact that team teaching means that people are teaching out of their comfort zone. Inevitably. Even if let's say one of the texts in the syllabus is a text they know backwards and forwards, if insofar as they teach it with someone especially from another discipline, they can no longer have the relationship with that text that they always thought they had. So teaching out of one's comfort zone troubling one's relation to material is essential to this. But there's also another thing that I think everyone... Hi, Lydia. Welcome.
Let's give her a hand.
The other thing is the sense of discovery, because if team teaching completely opens up because in essence you lose control, even presumption of control over the material, the teaching becomes an experience of discovery, as it always should be, but oftentimes it's not. And the discovery happens with everyone. Everyone in the classroom is in fact in a process of discovery. So we are always learning as teachers in this particular situation, always more than we do. We always learn when we're teaching, but perhaps not perhaps, but certainly more than we would normally do. The second thing that some of the students, of course, don't know this, it might actually terrify you, but we talked about CLEX meetings being seminars. That is absolutely true. One of the amazing experiences, which I thought it was even more than the CLEX meetings, was the fact that when we were discussing the PhD prospectus for every student, the entire CLEX would discuss the prospectus of every student in every department who was doing a PhD in ICLS. So you have to imagine incredible knowledge and sometimes expert knowledge and tons of gaps in between, addressing a project for a dissertation from a student who's obviously put a lot of work into it and has to, of course, we have to usher it into the next phase of writing. And this becomes, I'm sorry to tell you guys, an amazing experience in intellectual discussions. We were having fun with your prospectuses, oftentimes going into arguments amongst ourselves about certain things that would go beyond the prospectus because they would be elicited in this context. Now, I know we don't do this anymore. I understand this has happened because of practical reasons. We now have more than 200, close to 200 graduate students in this program. It is stunning if you think about it. There's nothing like it anywhere in the world. So it becomes impossible to do what we did, and I regret that it's not happening. I will say this publicly because it was, for me, every time this would happen, it was one of the best things, best experiences. So that was that was one thing. The other thing, it has to do with what happens outside of here. It is really amazing if you think about it. Then in the 20 years that this space has been in existence, there have been years of war. This society, particularly, although it does not admit it, right, has been at war continuously. And this is something that I remember living through, of course, more recently with the Occupy thing as director, when my senior seminar class rebelled in what was a kind of amazing moment in my pedagogical experience. The seniors said, it was right in the middle of the Occupy thing, there were all of them down there, and they said to me, this is irrelevant to reality, whatever we're studying. And I thought, my God, they're telling me that what I'm actually teaching is relevant to reality. We had a discussion. They were very rebellious. So I tore the syllabus in front of them, and I said, well, from this point on until the end of the semester, the syllabus is yours. You have to make up the class, which created a terrible disruption. But it actually worked. But I mentioned this, but besides the anecdote, for the fact that what we do here is academic and pedagogical, but it always had a public humanities, what is now called, it didn't used to be called that, public humanities component. It was always involved and interested in what happens outside the university, in other spaces, and how what we do here cannot be done without us being not just simply aware of what's going out there, but in many ways embedded and in what's going on out there. And the out there is huge and incredibly varied. And literally engaged with it. So this brings me back, to this thing I said before, which was, as I said, something that I desired since I was 16, the entwinement between the poetic and the political. You can see how, I said I had no idea at the time, but how this particular pedagogical space, which is really my home, and I cannot imagine any other one having been my home and ever being my home, is really, in more ways than one, the epitome of this kind of encounter between the poetic and the political.
Lydia, come on up.
No, I'm not going to go near. No, I'm not going to go near.
Yes.
I'm not going to come near you.
What I want
No,
to say, right?
Lydia needs room. But she won't get
Sorry, Fidelio.
No.
This weather, I'm glad, I'm happy to be here at all before this ended. Sorry, I missed your remarks. Heard a little bit.
It's all recorded.
It's very good.
It's all recorded.
Everything is recorded.
Play the video.
As I said would have said in my opening remarks that I wanted to welcome alums here back to ICLS. And I don't know how many of them missed their flight, but I hope tomorrow's symposium will be a great success. And I'm I became director in 2015, and this year I'm on leave at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. So my colleague Anu Kamarao has been acting director. I'm so glad we have an acting director like a situation like this, right? When I was not here, and so we've done. I think we've learned a lot myself. I've been learning on the job, being director, and I've I've had many connections with ICLS over the past, say, many years since I came to Columbia. First serving as the DGS, and in that capacity I got to know many students. I hope some of you are back here. And then, in fact, I learned about ICLS when I was teaching, before I came here, when I was teaching at UC Berkeley. When the Institute was first founded, the news traveled to the West Coast. And I had joined an appointment in Uncomplet at Berkeley and East Asian Languages and Cultures. And then got very curious about this new Center for Comparative Literature and Society. And then we learned that this would be a very different kind of experiment than your usual complet departments. Since I came out of that background at graduate school, and then I taught at Berkeley, and so we were all very curious as to where this program would be leading to. And since coming to Columbia, I have really benefited a great deal from working with the students, my colleagues, team teaching, and I think
we all talked about
former directors, how important it is to do team teaching. My first team taught class was a graduate seminar that I taught with historian Vicky de Grazia, Professor Victoria de Grazia. And then the two of us decided to do a class called Technologies of Empire. And it was an amazing experience. It was my first team taught class, and we had students who specialized in architecture. We had quite a few students of yours, Rangho, and then students from working in law, and of course art history and history. So it was an eye-opening experience. And then I actually had not known Professor Vicky de Grazia that well. She reached out to me, and later she said it was Professor Spivak who suggested the idea that you should teach a class together. And actually it worked that way, and I got to know Vicky quite well from teaching that class.
You know, the thing is this, Charles Armstrong and Kathy Nepomniachtchi, that was, you see, these are the things that I do. That one was also, I introduced
You
them.
remember that?
Yes, and the other one is Tom Keenan and Kendall. That's still kind of going on.
Right.
So thank you for mentioning this.
Well,
yes.
that was a fact, and I've since kept in touch with some of the students from that class. It was an amazing experience. And of course, ICLS has been also a hub for interdisciplinary research. We have a Mellon Sawyer seminar currently still running on global language justice. And this has also involved colleagues from many different disciplines. And we are also now working with Data Science Institute, collaborating with colleagues in computer science to really question how English, what to do with English as the hegemonic language of digital technology. And we've been, exploring various avenues of innovative research. So I think this is where we are now. I'm sure you've already spoken of your vision, the future. And I really think ICLS represents the future already.
The future.
Represents the future, yeah. Team talk classes across the disciplines, and also new research projects that people bring up. And did you talk about Medicine, Literature and Society, the undergraduate? Yeah, so medical school. Professor Rishi Goyal, he's over there, has been directing our undergraduate program in Medicine, Literature and Society, and we've been working also with medical school. I think that's what I wanted to, although I didn't mean to join this conversation. I thought I would just make opening remarks, but I didn't make it. So, thank you very much.
No, thanks so much. I think we're all thrilled that you did manage to get here from New Jersey, wherever that is. I feel like in a sense, throwing out the script, because there is a kind of, you get a feel, I think, already here for the spontaneity, which is real and was real. I can affirm from the beginning of the time that I was involved with ICLS, which was pretty much at the beginning. And the meetings were and surely remain seminars. When I read some of the books that you all mentioned, Other Cities, Other Worlds, that was basically born in ICLS, and Death of a Discipline, I was at that meeting, Okay, anyway, but there are a couple of things that maybe are worth trying to tease out. I'm trying to think also about what the folks in the audience might be interested in, so prepare your thoughts and questions here, because I know many of you are alumni or otherwise affiliated, including a number of colleagues who have been involved over the years. So, in a sense, I just one quick little anecdote to add to the trips down memory lane, but this is a way of setting up a quasi-question at least. At some point, I think it had to do with the art review, I think, that led to the transition from center to discipline. It took me a while, actually, to stop saying CCLS and say ICLS. And so, in fact, in my computer, I have a folder that's called ICLS. I didn't dare open it. But in there's something called CCLS. But at some point, I was given an assignment as a member of CLEX that involved other colleagues as well. And apparently this was being passed down from the provost's office, that we had to define and kind of describe what was special about the particular kind of comparativism that was practiced here. And it took the form of comparative comparativisms. In other words, the question was, what other forms of comparative practice and teaching existed in the wider sort of humanities and social sciences on campus, and what was special and different about CCLS that deserved, kind of institute status or something like that. And I have to say, I still can't answer that question. Maybe others can, but I thought it really did. I mean, being forced in a very bureaucratic way to think through this term, which is, as everybody here knows, an intensely loaded, historically dense term, and indeed the set of practices that have sort of accreted around it. Was helpful for me as somebody who I think I'm the only non-literary literature person at this table, and I've been a kind of inside-outsider or an outside-insider from the beginning in a variety of ways, one of which has to do with the comparative bit of comparative literature and society. So, so this was my sense of this at that time, and I think you mentioned it, maybe Andreas mentioned it quite early on, but it was worth bringing forward a little bit. Because another element in the context, Columbia context especially, and then historical context more broadly, was the transformation of this institution into a so-called global university. And the sort of infrastructure of area studies was a very important kind of foundation in the minds of many for that kind of transition. And it was very interesting, again, in a way that others described, to encounter this systematic critique of the area studies model as a way of thinking the future of, critical globality in some way. So, and I thought maybe we could try to draw that aspect out. It's both a kind of historical, context for the development of center into institute, but also a kind of epistemological one that I think runs through the various comments and anecdotes that we've heard. Then finally, the sort of X factor in the whole thing, the end society part, which I think formally related to the critique of area studies and so on, has stood and continues to stand for the kind of a reaching out to the particularly sort of qualitative or interpretive social sciences, but again with a certain amount of breadth. I mean, in terms of, if you look at the team teaching and so on, that maybe we're in a position to assess at this point, 20 years later, what has that meant? That this kind of, in a way, forced encounter between the literary humanities and then, by extension, the broader domain of the humanities and the social sciences in one form or another, constellated around this problem set that I just tried to sketch a little bit, the comparativism question and the area studies question, aka globality, globalization, and so on. Is that useful to any of you? Are there further things to say along those lines? Maybe we can also think about assessing in that sense, the critique of area studies. Who would like to take it? Come on. This is a quiet bunch.
Well,
What?
well, I don't know. I don't know about assessing. I actually think the assessing will be done.
Reflect.
The assessing will be done tomorrow by. I think that they're in a much better position to assess than we are. At least that's how I feel. Well, I mean, I know that this was discussed because I remember that I had come to the inaugural conference. In fact, I was in Princeton then, and you had invited me to come. The inaugural conference was my '98, I think it was. Yes. So I remember that was completely explicit. The kind of critique of area studies model was explicit in the project. I mean, it was sort of built into the foundation. So I think that has been conducted, and I don't know if it's worth conducting anymore, in the sense that now we are facing something else. The more interesting part of your question, I don't really know how to answer that, actually. is really the shift to what the so-called global university. I think that, which of course happens despite us, let's put it that way, but nonetheless something that we cannot avoid dealing with, is really this question is a great question and deserves some serious thinking, both thinking backwards but obviously thinking forwards. To what extent, I mean, ICLS, I remember Gayatri saying over and over again at endless meetings, trying to get people to understand how stupidly they were using the word global. I remember you saying that 100,000 times. So one might
At
say...
a faculty meeting in the Low Library, senior people said that anything that was not North American was global.
Right, it was just insane.
Last year.
It was but this has been going for years. So I think that ICLS has been, trying to not just simply resist, but work against this kind of shift. Right. While at the same time, kind of ironically, pointing to ourselves, saying, but we are people who are truly international. We come from different places, we live in different places, we think from different places, and we're kind of forced now to somehow theorize something that we are kind of almost embody. We are against it sort of in our bodies. So I'm not giving you an answer, because I really think that's a hard question to answer in real seriousness. It's a great question. I do think ICLS certainly is a kind of what's the word? I don't know. Some sort of break, against that kind of trend. But while at the same time it can inform those aspirations if they, at their best of intentions, if they exist as such. And I'm not sure whether we've been heard in that way. So in that sense, the assessment would not be a very good one. But that doesn't mean that of course, time is ahead of us. So that's the future part. I don't know.
Well, when I was DGS, I remember interacting very closely with students, and I thought, and I still believe that the students who drift into ICLS, whether at the undergraduate level or graduate level, are more or less misfits in their own. They don't feel at home in their disciplines, and some very creative people, very talented, with languages and also ideas, and they're willing to take risks. And with any kind of intellectual project, and I think we've had quite a number of these people here. I think we provide a space for the most creative people here. It doesn't matter in what direction you're going, and so I think that's the most rewarding part of my experience. And I don't usually, asking about comparison. Yeah. And this is something really we've been talking about for a long time. The discipline itself has always questioned itself about comparison. And if you ask me, I said I don't do comparison. There are certain givens there. People compare all the time. We interrogate comparison. We interrogate any kinds of commensurabilities that we discover. That imposed on us, or any discourse of incommensurabilities that try to make an argument against difference and things like that. I think what we do is precisely to make an intervention in that, and we're very fortunate to have had students, undergraduate students and graduate students who regularly participate in these explorations.
One thought perhaps about the issue of globalization and the one brief thought about globalization and the institution. It's of course true that we have constantly critiqued the enthusiasm, the triumphalism about globalization. This was part of my project with the Globalizing Cities project. At the same time, I couldn't avoid the language. And that's that's a crux in this whole problem. But I think there is a paradox with globalization that we are ready to articulate as best we can, and that in this enthusiastic global university discourse doesn't quite appear, which may be the fact that the more the world does get interconnected, the more incompatibilities begin to appear. And that has to be thought through. And that has to be thought through from my point of view also, in language, in poetry, as you said. For me, it was always aesthetics and politics out of the Frankfurt School.
Sure.
Very similar to what you were
Yeah,
doing.
absolutely.
But I think that's where maybe in the future there has to be added thinking within. Well, I'm not part of it anymore. I'm retired, so maybe it's already happening. But added thinking about the role of media. The role of media in the role of social media, digital media, how they change and transform our perception of the world, and how they create new forms of social interaction. This is a big topic. I can't raise it here entirely, but I would say that it pertains to the notion of comparative literature and society. That word "and," what does it really mean? And I think that's one of the areas where I would like to, I would think, at least my own thinking, I'm trying to understand what is happening politically in the world right now.
Well, now perhaps since Andreas has brought up the issue of incompatibility, I can kind of follow through on that just slightly. Now, globalization, I think, should be understood as both event and task. We are globalized willy-nilly as to whether we want it or not. That's globalization as event, creating the same system of exchange all over the world so that states become managerial of globalized economy. That's what it is. So, people then find, like Amartya Sen and company, all kinds of old ways of bringing people together, etc. That completely ignores anything like class, etc. So I'm not into those alternative descriptions of how people really did bring the globe together, etc. That's not my thing. So the globalization as event is creating now incredibly stupid situations. Like those huge conferences that are supposed to be international. People are invited from all over the place. Nobody knows the background of any other place. And the people themselves who have been invited have simply been invited because they're from there. They themselves are mostly English department, and they know nothing as they go on talking about their cultures. And somebody else says, yes, in my culture too, there's just something, just like that. Okay, so it's kind of class continuous, Northrop Frye, like string quartet and spider, similar because both have 8 legs. That sort of thing is that sort of thing is destroying us. These biennales and these huge. Everybody is a native informant. Nobody knows anything. So to an extent, how do we confront this? What is our task? And there I go with Andreas. What has happened in this kind of so-called network is that the largest sectors of the electorate everywhere, the class apartheid in education is absolutely in place, and they vote in tyrants because their democracy has body count. That's the fall of the shortfall of so-called how wonderful the social productivity of globalization is. There are nice things. I'm not saying that there aren't, but that would be stupid also. But what is forgotten is what you just mentioned. So I would like to say that even as we understand what globalization demands of us, behaving as if it's all networked, that particular thing I think we all should know something about the laws of regulating capital.
Right.
That's like, that's what transnational literacy has now become. Because that's really the bottom line. And actually we don't talk about capitalism, we should talk about the affect, greed. We go down below. I was just looking at the affect stuff right now. That affect is, I was just reading something wonderful by Judith Butler on this affect theory and Klein, etc., that affects are in fact interpretative. We don't just have affects directly, the difference between emotion and feeling in the old days. So to an extent we are talking about the fact that becoming human is the beginning of the Anthropocene. It didn't begin in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So therefore, this dehumanizing idea of education, where we look at affect, this is very, very different from just being gaga about digital humanities. I'm not against digital humanities, except, not at all, except the digital resources should be on tap rather than on top. We forget what humanities are if we make that, if we think of that as innovative. That's not, our friend in Milwaukee, what was his name, the wonderful German guy
I have another memory lapse.
Memory lapse? See, these are all senior
Wonderful
moments.
guy, no.
The guy who talked about, the guy who was stammered. What's his name?
Yost Hermann.
Yeah, Yost Hermann. Okay, he, when he was talking about the way humanities have always legitimized themselves by scientific self-descriptions, that's happening again. But this is a very dangerous thing. I think humanities should recognize that they are also something that it's very collective and that they actually supplement globality, because they can't be global. They are something that shows that their power is to say that the globe is not a world. So, and on the other hand, we live in the world. So I think we really have to, rather than all this triumphalism, as you're saying, first of all, we have to look at the shortfall of globalization. Second of all, we have to look at the death of specialisms because of this kind of global, well, international ain't global. So anyway, you're dying to say something, to say.
I was not trying to make a pitch for the digital humanities. On the contrary, I was trying to say that what the digital humanities, to the extent that I'm familiar with them, actually lack is a self-critical understanding of what media do to perception.
I heard you. I'm agreeing with you.
Right.
I'm agreeing with you. It seems to me that the resources of digitality are fantastic for art, for the hypertextual, for medicine, for all kinds of things that require this kind of fast stuff. I would be the last person to say no to that. I'm not a Luddite. But on the other hand, you come to the humanities and you decide that that's what's innovative, I think you have to have the courage to acknowledge that that's how you're being trivialized.
Yeah.
The real power of the humanities is not there. And we don't have the courage to say so. That we have to supplement this kind of enforced globality as event. And global is not, you see, when I was young, long ago, we were called foreign students. Then the good word became international. Mind you, nothing changed. The good word became international. And now the word is global. Okay? So the thing is,
You're still foreign.
You're still foreign. You are, in fact,
I am
on your alien registration card, you're an alien.
Right, absolutely.
And in this country,
Absolutely.
it's in fact becoming worse. I mean, I talked about Lyndon Johnson and the change in alien registration, 65, and when 500% Asian immigration, etc. We are going back to what it was before, right? So that to that extent, let's think it through. All this incredible promise of everything good happening because of globalization. I don't want to quote myself, but I will, which is, it is capital and data that can fully globalize. Everything else is damage control. And we have become the instruments of damage control, what Gramsci would call intellectuals organic to capitalist globalization, who are asked to pretend that that is where the humanities' future lies. I think to an extent we should also remember that every self-declared rupture is an unacknowledged repetition. This is not one of my formulas, and well, I don't want to go on, but that's my vision of what to deal with, what to do with this promise of globality.
Okay, Anu has something to add. We did manage to get a lively
We did.
response.
And this is just a sign of what's to come tomorrow, but it's 8:15, and I know many of you have come here under strange conditions, and I'm really glad that Lydia was able to make it here. But I want to thank you all for coming, and I think we'll continue this in other fora. But I also want to go back to something that Gayatri began with. She talked about being dragged in by women.
Yes,
And I was dragged in, Gayatri, by you to ICLS. And Lydia and I are now comrades and co-conspirators in this venture. So I think there's, speaking of repetition and reiteration, there's something very interesting going on. And I suppose in our case it was Tatas who was the laid-back, cool white guy.
I don't think the Northern Europeans would say that.
Exactly. You're a model of a laid-back white guy.
And we do have
More
to mark
Reinhold.
and we do have to mark some divides. I think Reinhold is in the Est part of the world, and as a historian, for me the question of politics and poetics is important, but I think also the literary question as it confronts the social question, which also comes back
The literary we
to
didn't
indeed
discuss.
the question of Marx and poetics, and social form. So thank you all.